Hi everybody, welcome to our Autism Ontario Summer Session series. This time we're featuring Ed Mahony and he's looking at the IPRC process. We're so excited to have him. This is webinar session number 2, the IPRC. I'm Catherine Buchan and I'm the Education Materials Coordinator for Autism Ontario. And I'm here just to remind you of a few housekeeping details. The first is you're hearing my voice, but you're not seeing me. This is meant to be an audio-only webinar, which means that you'll see a black screen. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with your computer or the feed that's coming in. It's just an audio-only webinar. So you can't see us, and I just wanted to remind everybody, for those tuning in that are new, that this should be simply the PowerPoint presentation and our voices. Ed designed this webinar in mind, keeping the IPRC process in mind, around some very concrete steps to understand this process and pull together some resources to help you through navigating this process. There are 3 parts to it. This is the second in a series of 3. If you haven't listened to the first one yet, you can access the link in the registration webinar, in the registration link, you can access the webinar. If you want to ask Ed a question, you can either type the question in live in the question box, or you can contact us over Twitter. We're going to have a Twitter chat about some of the ways that families have really used the IPRC process in positive ways. If you tag us at Autism Ontario or Ed Mahony with the hashtag #MakeYourIPRC real, we can have that discussion there too. So I'm going to hand it over to Ed now.
So in the last webinar, we were really focusing on the procedural aspects of things, the procedural rights and responsibilities that all parties have before an IPRC, and that's really useful to know. Now we're going to be looking at the IPRC itself, and I'll be looking at the intellectual piece, what you need to understand conceptually about an IPRC, and then next week we'll be looking at the more emotional, interpersonal skills part. The things I'm about to talk about come from Regulation 181/98 of the Education Act, as well as decisions that have been made by the Special Ed Tribunal that sometimes give more direction to the regulation, to what it actually means. So imagine if we look at this chart, this is what I would like to call the logic flow of an IPRC. The first piece we look at is this idea of evidence-based information.
Right.
The thing you need to understand is that drives everything. We need evidence of things. It can't be just a question of opinion. From that, if we look at what look at the left, we see the idea of exceptionality, placement, and we will be talking about that. But then below we see strengths and needs. And then below that we see programs and services. And the way to imagine this is everything in a way flows from the evidence. Evidence flows to the strengths and needs, and then strengths and needs flow to the programs and services. Again, to remember Emily, the evidence is she's visually impaired. The need is she can't see, she can't walk by herself. Okay, we need programs and services. That's how things flow. We're going to focus on needs first, and not on strengths. When you're imagining how to program for a child, it would all be strength-based, But when we're really looking at this process, with the exception of certain situations, programs and services do not derive from strengths. I could imagine a child that was gifted. Clearly, programs and services would emerge from that strength. But possibly the only value for this, for what we're doing right now around strengths, would be if you had a child that clearly was able to understand work at grade with appropriate programs and services, much as would be the case with Emily, actually. But we're going to be looking at needs right now, because needs drive programs and services. So now we're really focusing on this idea of needs. And I need to preface that by saying that as an educator, I'll be honest with you, I doubt I focus as much on that in my job as we're doing right here. Because for us, it's all about providing services, and this is something that if someone didn't push us to do it, we would be very happy with not doing it. But from a regulation point of view, from even a legal point of view, from the point of view where you're trying to advocate for your child, it's very, very important. So if we look at the flow chart, and we're recalling Emily, what's our evidence? We have medical reports, doctors that are qualified to say she's visually impaired and giving numbers to that, how visually impaired she is. And in this particular scenario, she's completely visually impaired. But there might be other reports from other people talking about needs that she has, people that are qualified to write those reports. And from that evidence, needs are self-apparent. They're apparent, right? In this case, clearly she's visually impaired, and that's a need, right? Clearly she has, there's safety concerns around Emily. And also there's an inability for her to access curriculum. And again, that's obvious to us when we think about this. Now, in red, it says visions, orientation, mobility. This refers to what often happens in education, where the 3 points above become truncated and telescoped into key words, often created through drag-down menus for how we create IPRC documents. And that's fine to a point, but the way I would imagine it is you need a need statement of sufficient clarity so it adequately describes your child and adequately leads to what programs and services she needs. And you have to constantly be on the lookout for that. We are not limited to the options in the drag-down menu. If need be, things can be typed in.
Right.
So let's take a minute and recall what we spoke of around Madeline.
Yeah.
So we can see how this would apply in an ASD situation potentially. A few things before I do this. This child is a synthesis of various children we have known, and in no way there is no such thing as typical with autism.
Yeah.
But some of the pieces here are very common pieces when we're talking about ASD.
Right.
So Madeline has a diagnosis. She's nonverbal. She does not use words to communicate. She becomes overstimulated by stimulus. She has some self-injurious behavior. She doesn't really do turn-taking. She has no reciprocal play with others. She can't dress herself or eat alone without assistance, and she wears a diaper. This in no way totally describes Madeline. These are just certain key things. So when we look at the IPRC logic flow for Madeline, there might be a host of evidence that we can look at. There might be medical reports with her diagnosis, and often in medical reports after the diagnosis, there are recommendations about what the child requires. There might or might not be a speech and language report, some sort of speech and language assessment. There might be an OT report, or maybe these things are coming. There might be some sort of report from a community partner, an ABA provider, private or public. A few thoughts about this. The way to imagine it is that everyone is entitled to have thoughts and recommendations about anything, I suppose. But when recommendations about programs and services are stronger, it's when people are within what I would like to call their competence, right? So, you know, your heart surgeon, when he's talking about your heart, we should listen.
Yeah.
But when he's talking about my taste in drapery, I don't have to listen so much, right? But it works like that for us too, right? An OT tends to talk about in autism around sensory things, and language people tend to talk about language, and ABA people tend to talk about behavior. And along that line, educators tend to talk about things, they're strong in talking about things that are involved with teaching, right? Now, there are blurriness. There's blurriness, for instance, blurriness between an ABA provider and a teacher. But everyone has a competence. And from that, we see a series of needs that are clear, come from the evidence, and like the case of Emily, are self-evident, right? She has problems with sensory things. There's reports on that from an OT. Therefore, we can say she has issues in the sensory area where she's overstimulated. We have reports saying she doesn't talk. We can say a need is she's nonverbal, unable to communicate. We have reports that have noted her self-injurious behavior, possibly the ABA piece. Maybe the educators too, right? And we note that as a need. Social skills, no turn-taking, again, it flows from a report. Life skills flow from reports. They flow from people. A little thought that I wanted to throw in is that often there's some confusion with parents and also with educators about this idea of needs. I have seen IEPs and IPRCs where needs, it would say something like, Madeline needs a sensory program. I can understand why someone would do that, but that's not really what the word means here. This is something inherent to the child, some sort of lack that makes it hard for them to be engaged in learning. The idea of need something, that would actually be a program and service.
Okay.
So just a little piece, and because there is some confusion about that. Do you remember when we were saying that in the case of Emily, there's a tendency to telescope words, and that maybe it wasn't a big deal with Emily? But let's look at what could happen with Madeline. So if we remember the need statement from the last sheet, it's likely that it might be potentially presented in this way: communication, sensory, self-regulation, social, and adaptive. And again, you can see reasons for that. It cuts to the chase. But the problem that I find with, for instance, this list is for this word self-regulation. It's a problem for me. We use this word a lot, but what is that referring to? A child runs out of class and constantly runs to a pond outside. Well, that's a problem with self-regulation. Self-injurious behavior is self-regulation. A child's hitting another child, that's self-regulation. A child is crying suddenly. It's just too broad for me. There's always a tension between parents who are trying to get the clarity and perhaps other people who are bridging like this. But I think I would push, particularly in the case for someone like Madeline, for enough clarity that the programs and services that you're going to ask for clearly find their source in the needs. And that's something you can advocate for fairly assertively. So sort of rising back and looking at the entire model, the entire logic flow model, we've been talking about evidence and how it leads into needs. I want to briefly talk about exceptionality, and I'll even mention placement. It's for purposes of this presentation, beyond this presentation, there is a lot of good reasons to talk about placement, but I don't think we need to right now. And around exceptionality, generally that doesn't come up. I'm doing this for Autism Ontario. The vast majority of people have a diagnosis of ASD. Now, where it does come up in two circumstances, but they're fairly rare. Historically, there have been some educators that have perhaps tried to make an argument that even though there's an ASD diagnosis, that for whatever reason they should not be identified with an autism exceptionality. It doesn't happen very often. When it does happen, there are measures that can be taken, mostly around appeal measures, and I don't think we're going to talk about that too much.
No, but you wrote a really great article for Autism Matters that we've included in the resources called To Identify or Not to Identify, so I think it's really important for all our viewers to take a look at that resource just to get a sense of, that question around identification.
And the other piece, the other condition that occasionally will occur where a child doesn't have a formal diagnosis of ASD, like now we have, let me get the right words for this, social
pragmatic
disorder, which sort of, it's been cleaved off the broader ASD diagnosis. And, I could imagine a board saying we can't use an ASD diagnosis because they don't have ASD, but the Ministry of Education and by extension the Human Rights Commission have been very clear on this issue. If you have a child with a diagnosis of in human rights language, a disability, in our language, something that could be an exceptionality, and it's something that's going to get in the way of them learning, we have to IPRC them. Mm-hmm. This comes up with kids that have ADHD, or it's not a formal exceptionality, but we have to find a way to do it.
Right.
So other than that, we're going to be focusing on other things. But if you have a question about that, there are the resources that Catherine mentioned.
Yeah, yeah.
So now we're really going to delve into this idea of programs and services. Looking at the logic flow, the way it works here is programs and services in one way flow from needs. So going back to Emily, her need is she's visually impaired. The program and services is something to address her visual impairment. Also, there's a link from evidence-based material to programs and services. It is very helpful if the suggestions for programs and services come from people that are in their competence when they suggest it. So an ABA person suggesting a functional behavior assessment, that's something that's linked to their job. Right.
And so I know that you put together a list of resources in context to make this a little bit easier to understand. We have a booklet that Ed's put together in our resource section, and it contains some information. It's got effective educational practices for students with ASD, the Regulation 181-98 material. There's also a link to the TDSB Special Education Plan, and then knitted throughout all of that, there are tribunal decisions, human rights tribunal decisions, and court decisions around some of the ways that programs and services have been advocated for.
So when we look at all this, we get a sense of what the broader educational community and human services community views as a program and service in Ontario.
Right.
So now we're looking at this idea of what exactly a program is. I could imagine some educators thinking when they think of the term our program at the board, it tends to be a very specific thing. But if we actually look at what the word is in the Education Act, in the Education Act itself, these are the terms that have to be there. The first is, interestingly, the word program assumes that a student has an exceptionality, and I thought that was interesting, which is another reason why we really want to identify children. Secondly, it's this idea that there's continuous assessment, that you're always modifying the program because it's clearly different than what the child that doesn't have a special ed program is having. It's modified on an ongoing basis. And that it has very specific objectives. And this language becomes very important when we talk about IEPs. This is the idea of IEPs that are clear and are changing, right? And secondly, a program is supposed to refer to the services that have to be in place to do the program. So there's a relationship. So a program is, I like to put it in simple language for me, is a program is stuff we do that we have to do to meet the child's needs,
Right.
so that they can learn. Fair?
Fair.
So in context to the IPRC process, a service refers to facilities, resources, support personnel, equipment needed to do the programming. That's the relationship. So again, going back to the easy way to imagine it, if a program is stuff we do, the service is people that do the stuff. And in Emily's case, it's like, oh, who's going to stop her from falling down the stairs?
Right.
Oh, that would be a person.
Right.
What does she need so she can read and write even though she can't see? Well, that would be some braille and people that set up the braille and the computers. That's a service.
Right.
So now if we again think about Emily, if we look at the evidence, we have medical reports and other reports. When we look at her needs, we talked about visual impairment, safety concerns, inability to access curriculum. So now in terms of programs and services, we're looking at braille, computer programs and equipment, support staff, something boards we often call mobility coach. And what you should see clearly, if this is working right, is those needs flow directly, those programs and services flow directly from the needs. And that's clear. And also that these programs and services have been recommended by professionals, and then the parent recommends it at the IPRC, referring to the professionals.
Okay.
So this slide for me is pivotal. It's funny when you do this sort of research and trying to think about how to do this online, you try to think of a way to teach it. And this for me became very clear. I'm calling this the Emily test, right? And I might even read a little bit of this because it's thought out. As we consider the world of needs, programs, and services, I think you really need to keep these questions right in the front of your mind. First, are the needs evidence-based or are they clearly evident? Thinking about Emily, I think we all agree that the need is evidence-based and clearly evident. Are the needs a function of the child's condition or diagnosis or disability? Now, this is not necessarily required, but it's really helpful if it is. Thinking particularly in the case of children with behaviors that are that get them in trouble.
Right.
That if the behavior is a function of their exceptionality or of their disability, then we have to approach the behavior in a certain way. Right. The third one, is the proposed program and services logical action supported by professionals to meet the need? Again, with Emily, that's clear. To the extent that it's clear in your situation, that's a very, very strong advocacy effort, right? And then finally, and it might take me a minute to explain what I'm going with this, is the request for the program and service a yes-no thing? That either it's there or it's not there. It's black or it's white. For computer people, it's binary, right? Those requests are much more powerful because it's clear that something's not there and should be there.
Right.
So, to the extent that the above conditions are met, what we just talked about, and that the facts are similar to Emily, the advocacy effort is sound, based on accepted practice, and is more likely to succeed. I kind of put this alone because this is really, really, really important. If you can see this, Emily's advocacy effort would be successful. Yeah. To the extent that you can make your advocacy effort be similar to Emily's, you have a stronger effort. And to the extent that it's not, it's a less strong effort.
Right.
Let's look at applying this idea of the Emily test to Madeline. We had talked about Madeline having potentially 4 or 5 programs and services she might require. We're going to focus on just one of them, the idea that she's nonverbal and unable to communicate.
So based on, looking at the Emily test and thinking about applying one of the things that we're looking at for Madeline, so around her, nonverbal, if we run it through your checklist to plug Madeline into it, can we see what happens? So are the needs evidence-based or clearly evident?
Well, I mean, it sounds in this case we would have sound reports that would say she's nonverbal, and clearly we can see she's nonverbal.
Okay.
So that's strong.
Okay. Are the needs a function of the child's condition, diagnosis, disability?
I would argue that the fact that the reports are written by people that work in the autism community and that there's a diagnosis on them implicitly links it to the diagnosis. Some literally say it
right.
as a function of the diagnosis, and I think that would be stronger.
Right. Is the proposed program or service a logical action supported by the professionals that meet the need?
And I think it would be logical when you think about it. She doesn't talk. She's in school. Mm-hmm. We want her to learn to communicate. Mm-hmm. Professionals are saying that these programs and services work. Common sense would tell you that we should do something to help her communicate.
Right.
That's a clear relationship.
Right. And so the last one is the request for the program service binary. Is it a yes, no, black and white situation?
It can be when you think about it, because particularly if the child's in grade 1, it's not in place. It should be in place. Yeah. It's clear either it's happening or it's not happening. Though it might be tied to other programs and services. For instance, a service that you could request might be participation of the autism team or of the speech and language pathologist. And that's another way to make it concrete. Are they involved or aren't they?
Right.
I'm going to spend some time talking about this particular issue because it's really, really important. There are limits to our ability to request programs and services. Mm-hmm. The way to understand it, and I think what I've written here, is that, okay, now that you've said that Emily, for instance, needs extra support to help her be safe, how that is done is within the power of the professionals that work with the child, the who and when and how. That part is not something that you can easily have advocacy strength with.
Right.
The analogy that works for me is imagine you go to your doctor, you're having trouble breathing, walking upstairs. Mm-hmm. And you go to the doctor, and the doctor says you have a heart condition. So there's your identification. You have a heart condition. I'm sort of forcing this, but and because of the heart condition, you have certain needs. You need to breathe, you need to walk, and your heart needs to keep beating, right? And so the doctor writes in their competence. They say, this person requires the following program and service. They require a specific heart surgery from an expert that does heart surgery.
Yep.
Okay? And that's great. You have that. Now, you have clearly the ability to advocate for that heart surgery because the expert said you need heart surgery, and if someone was in the medical community was putting you off, well, you have to wait 18 months, you would say, no, I'll die. The doctor says I need the surgery. There's a yes-no piece of that. It would pass the MOE test,
yeah.
right? Where your ability to advocate ends is, imagine now the doctor is going to make decisions when he's going to do it, and the surgery he's going to use, and the people he's going to do it with, and how he's going to do it. No reasonable person would expect that they could tell the heart surgeon the where, how, those questions,
yeah.
right? And that's the way it is in education as well. You can advocate for a program and service that meets a need, but how the school board administers the program and service,
right,
within limits, obviously, so that's doing the thing, that's within their decision-making power. And these sorts of issues have literally become tribunal cases, yeah. And tribunals have said that when it's a question of staff ratio, or is this teacher better with this child, or does that particular method work, you're very limited in your advocacy efforts, because we have to trust in the professional wisdom of the people that have that job, yeah. In society.
Yeah. Okay.
So Madeline's status as being nonverbal was one strand of the IPRC, right? Now, let's look at another strand. Let's look at Madeline's self-injurious behavior that she sometimes displays. I thought it might be really helpful for you, yeah. To consider the conditions that would have to be met for this to be a successful advocacy effort. Take a look at the list and imagine what you know about Madeline, and imagine what would have to be in place to make this argument of support and what that support might be. Now, this is not like a test. It's not like you're being tested on this, but we'll probably take this up next week before, yeah. We move on. And if you wanted to use Twitter in the way we described to answer this, or to ask a question around this, or if you wanted to bring this up after I'm done here just to talk about your thoughts about this, that would be great.
So that's great, Ed. Again, everyone can jump onto Twitter when they have some time to think about those questions for next week. We're also going to be taking a look at the emotional, interpersonal components around the IPRC next week. So it's going to be some thought around reasons for conflict and how to be at a meeting, and in addition, what to do when you hit a roadblock, because you said, you can guarantee you're going to hit a roadblock.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't think that's being negative. That's just
realistic.
It's realistic.
Yeah. So how to prepare yourself around some of the challenges and barriers that are going to pop up in this process. So today we looked at the concrete aspects around the IPRC process. Next week we're going to look at the more interpersonal pieces to the IPRC process. I want to remind everybody that there are resources available in the resource section of the webinar, including Ed's article around identifying or not, Regulation 18198, and then a package that we put together that takes a good look at the tribunal decisions, the Human Rights Tribunal decisions, and then the court decisions in context around advocacy and the IPRC process. And so we just want to say a big thank you from all of us at Autism Ontario for spending this time with us today. I know we're all very excited to be offering this series of webinars to everybody listening. And Ed, I'm going to turn it over to you for how to get in touch with you and some final thoughts.
A few thoughts here. First, I do want to thank everyone at Autism Ontario for making sense to my madness. I do have to say this, and you'll see this written on the website, that even though we refer and we occasionally to regulations and to kit tribunal decisions in law. I want to stress that this in no way should be construed as legal advice. This is for educational purposes only. And if you feel the need to get legal advice, you should contact one of many fine legal practitioners in the province that focus on these matters. And with that in mind, thank you for listening, and hopefully we see you next week.
Right. And if you want to get in touch with Ed, you can visit his website. It's available right there on the slides. He's also on Twitter and Facebook. And we look forward to connecting with you next week.
Thank you.
Okay, Ed, so we've got lots of really great questions coming up here. The first one that we're sort of looking at from a parent is, if a child requires a behavior plan, is this documented in the IPRC?
It's all the answers to my questions lately are nuanced. It could be documented in the IPRC. I doubt that by default it would be. Definitely, if you think about it the way we've described it, the behavioral need would be within the needs. You would have brought it up at the IPRC, my child needs a behavior plan. Most IPRC statements I've seen wouldn't include it, but the suggestion that I would give is for you to note that you said it and to write a letter to the people that went to the IPRC, talking in nice ways about the fact that your child needs a behavior plan and you discussed it at the IPRC. And in a way that becomes almost like a shadow document. That it becomes part of the IPRC by default because you brought it up to everyone there. No, it wouldn't be default that it would be there.
So in thinking about the Emily test and in thinking about plugging some of the needs into the IPRC process, we have a parent who's asked a question about a child who might have a flight risk associated with them. So this little one is attracted to spinning wheels when they run outside, when they see trucks passing by. How would that fit into the IPRC process?
So if we really are worried about that, so again, if we think this out, the first thing we would like is professionals that have a reason to have an opinion, a doctor, a behavior analyst, documenting that, you bringing it up as a need. This child is a flight risk. It's hard to, I mean, that's a metaphor, right? Suddenly leaves program spaces without notice, but flight risk, a runner, and that they have no sense of safety, they're attracted to moving vehicles. This would be in a need statement. You would likely talk about it as a proposal. I really feel my child is going to require a lot of support around her flight behavior. And again, there's a really good chance, given how most school boards do IPRCs, that they are not going to necessarily record that, but you've brought it up.
So I'm just going to remind everybody while we have a little moment here that these webinars will be available 24 hours after it goes live. So you can click on the link. For those of you that aren't able to attend next week or weren't able to attend last week, we recommend that you take a look at the webinar that's available from last week, and then if you need to wait to watch the pre-recorded webinar later for next week, you can do that as well. We have a question here from a parent that says her son has been included all the way up to grade 8 in his school. There's been no issues around inclusion in his program, but now that they're entering high school, the school is fighting to put him into segregation, like a special needs class.
Okay. For a question like this, I sort of have to transfer out of my experience because I work for a full inclusion school board, where this is just an alien thought for us. But this is very, very common in a lot of school boards. There's a sense in school boards that it's almost like in many jurisdictions there's two school boards. There's the elementary panel, the secondary panel. depending on the school board, sometimes there's literally the teachers have two different collective agreements. They're two different boards, really, and they don't talk to each other always as much as they should. So this is a very common piece that the inclusion is working fine to the end of grade 8, and then that's just not how business is done in that board in grade 9. So, I mean, the first thing you have to really think about is really what your views on this are, right? Like maybe you're comfortable with some sort of segregated setting. But if you're not, there are some things that can be done, and I'm not going to go into detail about them here, but I just want you to start thinking like this. There are no two school boards. There's one school board. All the schools are under the same Education Act. The Ministry of Education would prefer inclusion. If inclusion is working in grade 6 and grade 7 and grade 8, then a reasonable argument could be made that it should happen in grade 9 and 10 and 11. Depending on the situation, this could really be heavy lifting, right? Like, because the board literally has not structured itself in such a way. But I would like to point this out. Evidence of a child doing well in grades 6, 7, and 8 would be the IEPs, previous IPRCs, where you've talked about how great your child's doing and everybody is happy. That's, again, why we do IPRCs during the good times. Report cards, where per report cards, Emily's doing well with accommodations and she's a valued member of the class with appropriate support. The absence of notes to the contrary is evidence that things are going well. You see where I'm going with this. If you did decide to advocate that you wanted your child in regular class, you would have a reasonable amount of evidence that it works. If it works in grade 6, 7, 8, you would make the argument, why does it not work in grade 9? But I do have to caution people, depending on the situation, this could be a lot of work.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So we've looked at the IPRC now from a really concrete position. I know next week you're going to talk about the interpersonal pieces that sort of flow into this. What was your thinking about separating both of them out? So thinking about the IPRC in a purely logical, step-based system, and then sort of knitting it into the emotional.
Well, because I've met people that are one of two solitudes with that. I've met people that are really, really, really good with their people skills, and maybe it's something they do at work, but they really are. They don't understand how the system works, and that really holds you back. But I've also met the opposite sort of person, that they understand all the rules, but they don't get the human piece of it, that at the end of the day, all the people at the table are just people, and they operate as people do. And they are two distinct skills. Right. And really effective parent advocates are people that bring both of those things together and knit them together. And by pulling it apart, it really forces you to look at each one in detail. Yeah.
So I'm going to remind everybody that there are resources available in this webinar for download, both the PowerPoints with the links attached to them and also the articles that Ed referenced. We're going to invite everybody to come back again next week for the next webinar that's going to take a look at that interpersonal piece around working with your school boards, working with your principals, working with teachers, working with support assistants, around getting the most for your child in the education system. Ed, do you have anything else that you want to say today?
Just again, thank you for supporting this.
We believe in it. It's really important, and we're so grateful that you're here to share this information with us. And I just want to thank everybody that submitted questions today on the line, and we will see you again next Tuesday for the final webinar session for Ed and making your IPRC work for you.